Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. So I have a vivid memory of just over 10 years ago as a scared freshman walking onto the massive UCLA campus after having spent a year in Israel. And I sort of had in my head this idea that college campuses was a dangerous and scary place for a Jew, both on the religious side in terms of a lot of the secular influences, but perhaps more profoundly in terms of all of the anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism that everybody my entire middle school and high school career had been telling for me lay awaiting as I would step onto the college campus, only to sit there during orientation. And out comes this senior wearing a kippah who introduces himself as the president of the UCLA Student Union. And I remember being so taken aback and shocked. And really, it was the first time that I actually felt at home at UCLA, again, as this scared freshman knowing nobody. I don't remember much from the speech. All I remember is at the end, it was right before Yom Kippur. So he ended off with a nice Gemar Chatimat Tova, which I found incredible. But I am so privileged and honored today, now just over 10 and a half years later, to invite David Bocarsly onto J Life with Daniel. David, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Daniel.
So I am so excited to talk about your work at JPAC. Before we get into any specific questions, for somebody who's never heard of JPAC before, can you give sort of the elevator pitch?
Yeah, sure. So JPAC is the Jewish Public Affairs Committee of California. We are the umbrella organization that represents 32 now leading Jewish community organizations in California. And we work with all of them to put together a policy agenda and lobby the state government on behalf of the Jewish community's issues and values. So those issues range from what I call core Jewish community issues like fighting anti-Semitism and hate, supporting Holocaust and genocide education, and supporting the California-Israel relationship, to core Jewish community values around supporting children, immigrants, and older adults, and fighting hunger and poverty. So we're a diverse coalition, but we represent what I think is a broad spectrum of California's Jewish community, and specifically focus on the state government, which is an underutilized resource, but such a really important avenue of power and resources for a community.
Yeah, it really is interesting reflecting on just sort of my own, I guess, amateur political hobbyism, for lack of a better term, is that I feel like I know a lot about obviously national and international politics. I know a lot about local politics because I get, somewhat involved here, but state is 100%. I think it's that sort of awkward middle ground, which certainly underutilized. Before getting into any specifics of your work, I wanted to sort of zoom out and ask sort of a bird's eye view, philosophic, maybe even start with a little Jewish question here. One of the things that you were talking about in terms of JPAC's committed to upholding is sort of two different things, right? There's values that affect the Jewish community. So that's internal Jewish particularisms. And then there's sort of the wider, more global universalistic causes, which is helping people who need it, bettering our streets, in general, the more universalities of society. How do you sort of navigate this tension? I mean, this is definitely not a new tension. Our sources have been talking about this for quite literally thousands of years, but how do you sort of see your work? Is this sort of a particularistic Jewish cause? Is this more universalistic?
Yeah, great question. So we do work around both and broadly. We, as I said, we represent 32 organizations right now. That is every major Jewish federation in the state of California, every major JCRC, every major Jewish Family Service Agency. But we also have organizations that are national-based organizations with a statewide presence, like the ADL, AJC, HIAS, Hadassah, et cetera, and some local organizations too that do really important work on the ground, like Beit Tzedek and Jewish Big Brothers Big Sisters LA here in Los Angeles, JVS in the Bay Area and LA, et cetera. And I name all these organizations because you can start to see the breadth of the work that they do individually. And why is it that we've got Jewish organizations working on anti-Semitism and hate, combating anti-Semitism and hate? And we also have Jewish organizations doing core vocational training and immigrant rights work and all these other key social service work. It's because that is where the heart of the Jewish soul in California lies, right? There are Jews who are deeply engaged in Jewish life who believe that being Jewish is doing each of these things. There was enough Jewish support, staff-wise and financially, to create these organizations and sustain them. So when we're doing work on behalf of the Jewish community, we find it important to make sure that we're representing all of these organizations. So that's why we do work on both of these issues. I will say just a thing or two about how they're connected. Obviously, fighting anti-Semitism and hate, supporting Holocaust and genocide education, supporting Israel are core to who we are as Jews. But there is a really strong argument to be made about why a lot of the social service and civil rights work that we do is as well, and how it connects to one another. So as a community, we talk a lot about two primary reasons to do social justice work. One is because it's deeply rooted in our tradition and Torah, et cetera. And the second is because we have a long history of oppression ourselves, right? And so the saying goes, we must help fight oppression wherever we see it. And these are both really important reasons to remember and to reiterate, but they're rooted in this kind of monolithic idea that Jews are all white or privileged or no longer suffering from our own oppression. And it's important to root this work in two other very important reasons too. The first is when we talk about helping immigrants, people of color, people experiencing food insecurity or homelessness, et cetera, we're also talking about helping Jews because our community is diverse. And it's made up of immigrants and people of color and people experiencing food insecurity and homelessness and so many others, right? And so the other reason is also because when we show up for other people, we build trust and we build deep relationships with others who we can then ask to show up for us when we need it. So there's a strategic value add to being in partnership. So to kind of bring your question back to its core, in my mind, these are all core Jewish issues, right? We are helping, no matter across the spectrum of what we do, we're helping Jews. We're helping other people too, because that is really deeply rooted in who we are. But we're also helping Jews. We're helping ourselves in the process.
Yeah, I really like that. There's sort of this constant dialectic of idealism and pragmatism, of which our tradition definitely knows a lot about both. Do you have any sort of concrete examples of sort of that? What you're describing, at least in the second way, is sort of allyship with other communities, right? Oftentimes the Jewish community is, for a whole variety of reasons, caught in this weird limbo where there are some groups and some people, we obviously don't have to name all the groups now, but some who want to see the Jews as just ordinary white folks that aren't a minority that just happen to have a different faith tradition. And then others who see the Jews as this completely different subgroup, some mixture of, ethnic, race, nationality, whatever there. So Jews oftentimes get caught in this sort of identity political limbo, for lack of a better term. But do you have any good examples or stories of this allyship coming to term?
Yeah, one that I'll share is an example from my last job, actually. Prior to being the executive director of JPAC, I was on the other side of things. I worked in the state legislature running the Legislative Jewish Caucus, which is now a group of 18 Jewish elected officials, and I was their staff director. And one of a big program that we organized in 2019 was for a group of Jewish and Latino elected officials to go down to San Diego. This was kind of at the height of the family separations instances under the Trump administration. There's a lot of attention around people fleeing real persecution at home, near-death experiences, coming to our border and then being separated from their families and being put into our detention centers. So we took a group of Jewish and Latino elected officials down to the border to Otay Mesa Detention Center to meet some of these asylum seekers who were held in the detention center there. And we heard about their harrowing stories, escaping persecution at home, and how they came to our borders trying to seek a lawful process to get into our country and were really imprisoned in many ways. And it was deeply moving and scary and heartbreaking. And then we took these Jewish and Latino elected officials down the street to the Jewish Family Service Migrant Shelter. And now Jewish Family Service is one of the amazing organizations that's part of the JPAC coalition that is on the front lines, helping migrants access health benefits when they cross the border, legal support system, financial support systems, so many different resources that get them into shelter and into jobs when they're here as they're awaiting the determination on their status. And it was, I can tell you, I watched the faces of these Latino elected officials and saw how they were transformed, seeing how Jews were on the front lines doing this work. And if you need a more poignant example of how this translated into direct impact, this was the same year where there was the really tragic Chabad of Poway shooting. And after the shooting, it was, this first major synagogue shooting in California. We had a big press conference up in Sacramento where we invited the leaders of all the other ethnic caucuses to come and speak about the need to support the Jewish community fight anti-Semitism and hate, and support institutional security. And we invited the leaders of all the other ethnic caucuses, and they all came. They all came. They all spoke very beautifully, but notably, the chair of the Latino caucus got up and spoke and said, I saw firsthand how Jews risk their own safety and security on the front lines in San Diego, helping predominantly Latino migrants. And because of that, I and the Latino caucus and the Latino community stand strongly with the Jewish community today, and we demand that their requests for community security are met. It was this beautiful, powerful moment of solidarity going from one side to the other. And at that same press conference, the governor came and announced that they were actually going to meet our request and grant our community $15 million to support synagogue security initiatives. It wasn't just for synagogues; it actually goes to all nonprofits at risk of hate-motivated violence. But it was an initiative driven by the Jewish Caucus and driven by JPAC that year. And because of the community-wide support, we were able to get that into the state budget that year.
Yeah, that's really powerful. That's a really great example, because I also love both the pragmatism, but also there is sort of an idealism there of sort of, you build the world you want to live in to some extent, where we want a world in which different communities are obviously looking out for each other, not just for sort of this tit for tat, you help me here, I'll help you there, but really everybody is sort of coming to the table just wanting to create a California, or in other cases, a nation or a world that really is just better with a capital B. Also, as somebody who's employed by many of these nonprofits and synagogues that has been a recipient of these grants, definitely thank you for your work there. Thanks. So I imagine, of the listeners to this podcast, there are a lot of college students, and then there are a lot of people that are probably connected with high school or college students, maybe children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews. Can you sort of give us a professional biography of your life and sort of how you ended up here, for somebody who maybe is studying political science in college and is interested in politics, but not really sure what that means, and there's sort of all these vague directions that one could go in? How did you sort of end up from, high school up until now?
Yeah, sure. So I was as lost as can be in college. I didn't pick my major until halfway through junior year, and didn't figure out what I wanted to do with my life until about 3 years after I graduated. But I knew that I was deeply committed to the Jewish community. And so when I went to UCLA, I naturally sought out Jewish life to make community, the big campus feel smaller. And that was my first home, Hillel, and doing organizing around the Jewish world and around Israel. And I got involved in student government because I found that there was a lack of Jewish representation in student government. I felt like we needed more of our community's voices heard in that space. And so I wanted to learn about it and get involved, and so I did. Through meeting people from different backgrounds over the course of many years, and a lot of different experiences, I got involved in activism around LGBTQ issues, around immigration issues, and ultimately found myself as student body president my senior year, which is the really kind story you told when you walked in, is where our stories start to meet. And in that role, I was working very closely with local and state elected officials, trying to advocate for greater access to higher education, which is largely done at a state level. So I got to know a lot about this kind of obtuse level of government that is not really often in the news, and realized how valuable and important it was. So after college, I was a little lost. I worked in the private sector for a little bit, and then I realized I really wanted to be back in the community impact space. I did the Coro Fellows program in public affairs in New York, which is an amazing program. Highly recommend it, because over the course of the year, you work in 6 different sectors of policy. So you get a lot of different experiences, and found that ultimately electoral politics is where my passion lay. And so I ended up working for Congressman Jerry Nadler in New York. He represents the most Jewish congressional district in the country. And I was his Jewish and Israel guy. And then when I came back to Los Angeles,
I cannot imagine, sorry to cut you off, the diversity and plethora of emails you might have gotten from the community every time something happened around Israel.
It was incredible. It was really an amazing experience. I mean, also opened my eyes to this idea. I mean, it's a niche world, but that you could work at the intersection of Judaism and politics. And I feel like ever since then, I've held a lot of those roles that exist out there. So when I came back to Los Angeles, I was getting my master's in public policy and started working for Senator Ben Allen, who represents the most Jewish legislative district in the state. And if I could be so bold, probably the most Jewish legislative district in the country. And I was doing Jewish work for him as well. And it was just, fascinating to be in those spaces with a Jewish lens, and also to be back in LA and be doing this work at the state level where I already found a deep passion. Senator Allen, after a couple of years of working together, became the chair of the Legislative Jewish Caucus and brought me on to run the caucus. And through that, I ended up working for Senator Scott Wiener up in the Bay Area as well when he became leadership of the caucus. And in that role, I found JPAC. JPAC was our biggest ally in everything we did. They represented all the major Jewish organizations in their lobbying efforts to the state government. So I was on the receiving end of a lot of JPAC lobbying and built a really great relationship with them and all of their leaders. So when the spot opened up, I put my name in the hat, and it's been an incredible ride.
Yeah, that's really incredible. And, I can't help but nerd out a little bit on some of the implicit history that you're bringing up, because one of the interesting things when you look at the history of Jewish political activism, and I'm not just talking about, 50 years, in the last 2,000 years, Judaism has sort of had let's try to stay as far away from the government as we can in hopes that they leave us alone. I'm sort of reminded, there's this famous and comedic scene in Fiddler on the Roof where somebody asks the rabbi in the opening song tradition, do you have a prayer for the czar? And the rabbi says, of course, I pray for the czar that he stays far away from here. And, it sort of cues this, really, if we want to, if anyone here is sort of a Jewish history junkie, this tradition actually goes all the way back to Jeremiah, when during the first exile in the 6th century BCE, I won't put the listeners through too much history there. But what's fascinating of what you're describing in the current American political sphere is really an area where Jews are actually coming into both politics and political advocacy with sort of wearing their identity externally. And, no pun intended, because, obviously you go around with a kippah, but it really is a completely different way of navigating with politics. I don't even know if I have a question, but I just sort of wanted to flag that because I really do think it's an incredible difference and something our listeners might not be as privy to just how unique the situation is in late 20th century, early 21st century America.
Yeah, no, it's such a good point that you make. And it's interesting. I think a lot about kind of Jewish engagement in civic life over the course of our history. And actually, a dear mentor of mine, Professor David Myers at UCLA, writes in his brief introduction on Jewish history that the Jews have survived this long, despite so many other people's, disappearing, because of this constant fluctuation of assimilation and anti-Semitism. Right, we assimilate, and just as we might assimilate ourselves out of existence, we experience a moment of anti-Semitism that forces us to reckon with our uniqueness, right? And then we, in the next moment, we seek to assimilate again. And it's really interesting to look at Jewish history from that lens, from my perspective. I then look at Jewish engagement in civic life in America in, say, the last 150 years, right? After the big waves of immigration from people who were fleeing anti-Semitism, largely from Eastern European pogroms, but other places around the world as well. As an oppressed people in America, we, for many years, were very active in civic life. We're very active in protest movements and joining hands with other marginalized, oppressed communities because we were truly victim to a lot of the same oppression that they were. So you see Jews really engaged in kind of the founding of the labor rights movement in the early 1900s and the women's suffrage movement. Of course, we know the long legacy of our engagement in the civil rights movement. And then I look at the last 30, 40 years, and I start to see a pattern. As Jews gained racial and economic privilege, let's say white Jews gained racial and economic privilege in America, you start to see this familiar pattern, right, of us going from an oppressed people to starting to assimilate a little bit. And a lot of institutional life actually shied away from civic engagement. It's the Fiddler on the Roof motto, right? I think we're hitting a moment of inflection in our community where anti-Semitism is hitting record levels. And we're starting to realize that assimilation isn't protecting us. It's not saving us in this moment. And we actually need to be engaged very actively in civic life. So now JPAC has been around for 50 years, but even our organization has dealt with the same fluctuation of engagement that our community has as a whole. We've been visible in the state legislature, but it doesn't mean that we are as visible in the public eye as we are today. And only in recent years, I really believe our member organizations have started to invest in this space in a really significant way, because they realize that when we show up visibly as Jews, doing work both for ourselves and for all vulnerable people, we are actually doing the best thing we can to protect ourselves, building meaningful relationships with other oppressed communities, being visible, highlighting how we exist in the world and some of the struggles we deal with. I think that we are hitting a moment of reckoning for our community as a whole, and that coincides non-coincidentally with the work that we're doing being much more visible and much more significant.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and that paradox or sort of wave that Professor Myers brings up is really interesting. I actually think about that a lot. I probably shouldn't be telling this story in any sort of public forum, but that's never stopped me before. I was at a meeting. I mean, must have been 4 or 5 years ago, before I learned to, temper what I say in public too much, although this example is not shining well on this track record. But I was at a meeting sort of a bunch of campus professionals, and everybody was sitting around, it was at a conference afternoon, just brainstorming ways to increase Jewish engagement. And, everybody, you had one group saying, oh, we should, free dinners, barbecue, whatever. And as a joke, I was also probably a little sleep deprived. I would say, well, let's just bring BDS to campus. That'll, we'll have record Jewish engagement. For the listeners, that is a joke, but it really does touch on this wider paradox of one of the best ways, and one of the things that we've seen historically is that is that anti-Semitism really does bring out Jewish engagement. I mean, it's certainly a problem. And I think, just on the personal side, one of the things that I've tried extremely hard to do and will continue to try hard to do as an educator is to make as much of Jewish life about these sort of Jewish positives as possible, because, especially around college students, I don't want somebody's primary Jewish identity to be rooted surrounding anti-Semitism and victimhood, although, we obviously have those things. I want to talk about positive Jewish values and all of these things. But yeah, this is definitely something I think about a lot. Taking sort of one more step back, one of the other things that I think is sort of you're getting at here is this idea of what a lot of scholars call diasporic nationalism among the Jews, right? Where, just for a little bit of background, right, obviously in the late 19th, early 20th century, especially post-Enlightenment for Ashkenazi Jews, people were trying to figure out, the sort of age-old Jewish question of what are sort of Jews' place in wider society, all of these things. Of course, we know one answer, which was Zionism, right? It was, we need a political entity that's going to be, controlled by Jews to protect Jews. One other answer, which didn't seem to really get as much traction in the mid-20th century, but what you're describing sort of reminds me on this. And this obviously is not mutually exclusive with Zionism, but this idea of diasporic nationalism, of rejecting the idea of saying, no, actually, we're all in some waiting room until we move to Israel, but actually saying, no, American Jews are here to stay in this country. We are committed. We are committed to bettering the country for not just us, but for everybody. And, obviously that can come with supporting Israel, that can come with not supporting Israel, but Israel is almost a secondary aside to the primary political concerns here, which is interesting when just thinking of JPAC, because a lot of times when I hear, I don't know if it's just sort of this weird, almost like Rorschach test or whatever, when I see the words Jewish advocacy on an email or piece of paper, I immediately think about Israel, which is very strange, right? Because you have AIPAC and J Street and all sort of the other ones, but I actually really like this sort of constant focus of, no, Jewish advocacy is not trying to say, well, how can we best fund defense packages for Israel, right? That might be part of it, but actually a lot of the work is taking place here.
Yeah, no, first of both the anecdotes you just shared are just so poignant, and I appreciate you bringing them into the conversation. And I couldn't agree with you more. There is something refreshing about being in a space. I mean, Israel is, I don't want to undermine this. Israel is incredibly important to us as an organization as well. We recognize how important it is to the California Jewish community, and we want to represent that in the work that we do. But at the end of the day, we are a statewide advocacy organization, and we leave litigating Israel's politics up to the feds, and the advocacy organizations that do work at the federal level. And so we really like to focus on Jewish ritual, right? Educating other non-Jewish elected officials on what it means to be Jewish, on what are some of the core values that our community has, how we engage in Jewish life, how we are a complicated people, as you kind of hinted at the beginning, right? The nexus that we sit at between Judaism as a religion and a people and an ethnicity and all of that, right? There's so much work to be done about kind of positive local Jewish community work, and so Israel will come up on occasion, but it comes up when we are thinking about how is Israel's kind of right to exist challenged or supported in California, right? It's not, we're not getting into the nuances of AIPAC and J Street, really. And we don't have to, we're in a way blessed that we don't have to kind of navigate the really complicated relationship and diverse relationship that the Jewish community has to Israel these days, as hard as it is now than ever before. But I just want to quickly say that, like, we'll get involved, when for example, BDS comes to the California Ethnic Studies curriculum, right? That's an example of something that's a state issue, that we wanted to make sure that the core concept of Zionism, right, that Israel must exist as a safe and sacred place for Jews, that remains a true value of the vast majority of California's Jewish community. And we want to make sure that is represented on the state level too. So we'll get involved in that kind of stuff. But there is something refreshing and beautiful about having a focus on who we are as a people, and how we exist in America today, and what are our core values.
Yeah, I love that. And like a lot of things, I think, Judaism and Jewish wise, right? You can obviously, have both to some extent, right? This sort of question that, obviously has two answers of, are Jews committed to bolstering Israel, or are Jews committed to bolstering America? The answer, it's sort of even a non-question in the mind of a lot of Jews. Right. I want to hone into one of the specifics that I know you highlighted before, that I know that JPAC does a lot of work around. It's something that a couple of years ago, I remember doing a lot of research and actually writing an article on the topic, is Holocaust survivors in America and financial well-being. I remember, this data is from 2-3 years ago, but, some data from Blue Card, which does a lot of reporting on Holocaust survivors in America, they reported that 1/3 of Holocaust survivors in America live under the poverty line, and nearly 2/3 sustain themselves on less than $23,000 a year. That statistic is just so mind-boggling. For so many reasons. It's mind-boggling from an American point of view, mind-boggling from a Jewish point of view. There obviously are a lot of organizations that, a lot of nonprofits, also a lot of advocacy organizations in that space. But what's the problem there? Meaning, how is this something that hasn't been solved already, either externally by governments or internally, even by the Jewish community, saying this is a priority for us?
Yeah, no, it is. The statistics are incredibly shocking on this, and heartbreaking. And I think the major problem here is that, first of all, most of our Holocaust survivors are older adults, right? And there are strategies and systems that our society has put into place to help care for older adults. And we have oftentimes forgotten that the trauma inflicted on Holocaust survivors is unlike anything anyone else has ever experienced.
Sure.
And needs to be responded to with specific trauma-informed care. And right now we think of lower income Holocaust survivors as any other, lower income seniors. And we treat them the same way and provide the same resources, and they can't take advantage of the same resources. So one major example is institutionalization. We have a lot of, senior homes for, across the state. But going into an institution that has rigid, meal schedules and people who serve in many ways as authority figures, that oftentimes doesn't work for Holocaust survivors.
Of course, yeah.
And so we just don't have the right support systems to care for this specific community of people. And we've never really done a great job at it. Now we've got Jewish family service organizations across the state that are incredible and leading social service providers for these for these older Holocaust survivors, and they've figured out how to provide trauma-informed care and core resources so that Holocaust survivors can age at home. The problem is they don't always have the resources to be able to help all of the survivors, and survivors might not necessarily know how to access the resources that Jewish Family Service provides. So we, in JPAC, we have 8 Jewish Family Service organizations that are part of our coalition that serve thousands of survivors across the state. And this past year, actually, there was an amazing advocacy effort that resulted in $36 million from the state budget going towards Holocaust survivor assistance. And this is new. We got some money in this program 4 years ago, and that total was $3.6 million. We got a 10-fold increase, and we're still not even sure we're going to meet the demand. Wow. And to put into context, the federal government provides Jewish family service agencies across the country some money for this. And I think the max, if I have this right, the max they've ever provided was something like $10 million. The state alone last year provided $36 million. So we're waiting to see the fruit of those efforts, but we're far behind the ball on this one, and we've got a lot of aging survivors, and we're losing survivors every single day that really just need critical care that they haven't been getting.
Yeah, 100%. Well, the work is really powerful. I mean, in so many ways, but that specific issue, I mean, just like many others, is obviously overlooked. So, it is nice to know that there are people within our community that are sort of having this top of mind. So I have one more sort of general question, and then I guess just a couple of quick follow-up questions, unless you think I missed anything. So there are a lot of issues that, if I'm sort of labeling and, categorizing all of the different issues in JPAC, there are the issues that I think, as you say, I think this is the largest representation of Jews in any state. Makes sense. California has quite a number of Jews. So there are obviously things that I think you can probably get 99.9% of Jewish approval on in terms of the rubber stamp. I hesitate to say 0.1 because there's always some Jew that'll come up with some reason to play contrarian. What are the issues, if any, that you think are actually somewhat divisive within the Jewish community? And how do you navigate situations where you might, know or think, well, I know we're going to do this because we stand by these values, but we also know, let's say, 35% of California Jews will actually vehemently disagree with this policy decision, whatever that might be.
Yeah, so the way that we put together a policy package every single year is by taking recommendations from our member organizations. Hey, what are the issues you really care about this year? Are there specific bills or budget items that you're focusing on? We'll also go to our coalition partners, partners that we've worked with for years in the older adult space, in the immigrant space, in the anti-hunger, anti-poverty space, figure out what their priorities are too. I'll work with my lobbyist. I've got an incredible lobbyist up in Sacramento who's tracking every single bill that's being introduced. And I work with my lobbyist and put together a proposed policy agenda that I'll ultimately run by every single one of my member organizations. And that's a really robust process for us. We figure out if there are any red flags for our member organizations in that really in-depth research phase. And certain things just don't ultimately make the cut. At the end of the day, we want to put together a policy package that is diverse, that is ambitious, that will make real change. And also, it will focus on issues that not every one of my member organizations cares about. So if one organization cares deeply about anti-Semitism, they might not care so much around work about food insecurity. But as part of this coalition, they're bought into this notion that this is what the Jewish community is invested in as a whole. These are issues that a large fraction of the Jewish community care about, and what the majority of the Jewish community at least are values aligned with. Now, not everything makes it into that cut. There are some issues that ultimately are like, this is a little beyond the controversial level that we are comfortable with.
Sure.
But we've built over 50 years now, a culture that we're going to put together a policy agenda that everyone it's not going to be everyone's first priorities, but everyone is going to be comfortable with it because it represents a vast majority of California's Jews' values.
Yeah, I really love that. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you, all sorts of questions about how people can learn more and get involved. Before we go there, is there anything we missed? Anything you were hoping to talk about? Any other issues that, you were sort of itching to bring up?
There's because of the nature of our work, we do so many things. So I don't want to zone in on any one particular item. I've appreciated this conversation and happy to tell people about how they get involved.
Yeah, sure. Go for it. Yeah. So if somebody's listening and wants to get involved either on the advocacy side or the, political side or, any which direction, how can people find out basic information? And then, what are some opportunities for the community?
Yeah. So first, we've got a pretty robust newsletter and would encourage anyone who's interested in this type of work to subscribe. You can find out about it at our website. It's jpac-cal.org, jpac-cal.org. And scroll to the bottom, you can sign up for our newsletter. But if you want to be more engaged, there are a couple of really great opportunities. First of all, we do an incredible conference in Sacramento every single year. We bring up hundreds and hundreds of Jewish community leaders and community members from across the state. These are people who are affiliated with one of our organizations or not at all. These are staff members, board members, executives, young professionals, people looking to get involved in Jewish community organizing for the first time. It's an incredible array of Jewish life and an opportunity to really meet people who care about a lot of the same things as you from across the state. And they come up to Sacramento. It's a 2-day program. This year, it's May 9th to 10th. And we engage with, statewide elected officials. And we had, last year, I think we had over 1/4 of the entire legislature come and participate in our program, whether it be at our reception, at our dinner, speaking on panels, being our keynote speakers. We had the Lieutenant Governor and the Attorney General as keynotes. We do a ton of really amazing networking events. And then we break everyone up into groups and actually go lobby. We bring people to the state capitol and they meet with a handful of elected officials' offices and talk to them about the different priorities for our community. And so it's just been a really powerful and empowering event for a lot of people. And it's open to anybody, open to Jews and non-Jews who want to be involved in this work. And so I really want to encourage people to come up. We're also starting to build out some advocacy initiatives throughout the year that are to be announced on our newsletter. So stay tuned there. And we're specifically looking for young professional engagement. If you're a student, if you're a young professional, we want to build out some different networking ideas that we have. So putting a call out to all students and young professionals who specifically want to be more engaged in this to reach out to us directly.
Perfect. Well, David Bocarsly, thank you so much for coming on J Life with Daniel.
Thanks, Daniel. It's been great. Yeah. La, la, la.